Welcome to Acemyexams Learning. Let us get started with today's learning.
Question: the end of the Cold War and a new world order. Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union in the 1980s changed the South African political landscape, which influenced FW de Klerk's decision to introduce reforms from 1989. Do you agree with this statement? Substantiate your answer with relevant historical evidence. Introduction. The 1980s were a transformative period in global politics, marked by the reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. His policies of Perestroika and Glasnost not only reshaped the Soviet Union, but also had profound implications worldwide, including in South Africa. As the Cold War came to an end, the apartheid regime in South Africa could no longer rely on communism as a justification for its policies, and international pressure mounted for change. This essay agrees that Gorbachev's reforms fundamentally altered the global landscape and influenced FW de Klerk's decision to introduce political reforms in 1989. The collapse of communism, changes in world politics, and the pressures faced by both the National Party, NP, government, and the African National Congress, ANC, played a significant role in the eventual dismantling of apartheid. The Soviet Union was facing severe economic hardships when Gorbachev took leadership in 1985. In response to the stagnating economy and the inefficiencies of the communist system, he introduced two major reforms: Perestroika, economic restructuring, and Glasnost, political openness. Perestroika allowed small-scale private ownership and reduced government control over production, representing a shift away from traditional communist economic policies. Glasnost encouraged open criticism of the government, something that had been unheard of under previous communist regimes. These reforms led to growing demands for an end to communism and the establishment of full democracy across the Eastern Bloc. As a result of these reforms, communism began to collapse across Eastern Europe, leading to the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was no longer regarded as a global superpower, and communism was no longer seen as a global threat. The USA and its Western allies could no longer justify supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa under the guise of anti-communism. This shift in global dynamics put pressure on the National Party government to begin negotiating with the ANC. The collapse of the Soviet Union had a direct impact on both the National Party government and the ANC. The Soviet Union, which had been a major financial and military supporter of the ANC, could no longer provide aid to the liberation movement. This left the ANC in a vulnerable position, unable to sustain its armed struggle against the apartheid government. At the same time, Western nations, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, began to exert pressure on the NP government to negotiate with the ANC or face continued economic sanctions. The defeat of the South African Defence Force at the Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale in 1988 further weakened the apartheid government's position. This defeat forced the National Party to start negotiations with communist forces over the independence of Southwest Africa, which would later become Namibia. South Africa withdrew from Southwest Africa, and in 1990, SWAPO, a liberation movement, won the elections, leading to Namibia's peaceful transition to black majority rule. This peaceful transition served as a blueprint for South Africa, demonstrating that a peaceful handover of power was possible. By the late 1980s, it became evident to many influential members of the National Party that apartheid was unsustainable, both economically and politically. They began to realize that apartheid was not the solution to protecting white economic interests in the long term. Instead, they believed that reforms were necessary to include the development of a strong black middle class, which they saw as a bulwark against revolution. This shift in thinking represented a significant break from the earlier policies of rigid racial segregation. Furthermore, the South African government could no longer rely on the threat of communism to justify apartheid or generate Western support. The world was changing rapidly, and apartheid policies were seen as anachronistic in the new global order. As communism collapsed and world politics changed, it became clear that South Africa's apartheid regime could not survive without Western support, and that support was rapidly dwindling. By 1989, FW de Klerk had come to power in South Africa, and he recognized that continuing apartheid was no longer viable. De Klerk believed that the ANC would be weak after the collapse of Soviet support and the end of the Cold War, making it a more manageable negotiation partner. He showed a willingness to negotiate with the ANC, in part because the Soviet Union could no longer provide financial or military support to the ANC, as it was bankrupt and favored peaceful negotiations over armed conflict. Without Soviet military and financial support, the ANC was unable to continue its armed struggle against the apartheid government. This led the ANC to also show a willingness to negotiate with the NP as an alternative to continuing the conflict. De Klerk gradually began to accept that the black struggle against apartheid was not a conspiracy orchestrated from Moscow, which allowed him to engage more seriously with liberation organizations in the pursuit of a lasting political solution for South Africa. On 2 February 1990, de Klerk made a historic announcement. He unbanned all anti-apartheid organizations, including the ANC and the South African Communist Party, and he released political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. This marked the beginning of negotiations between the National Party and the liberation movements. The collapse of communism and the end of Soviet influence had made these negotiations possible, as both sides recognized that the Cold War-era dynamics no longer applied. The talks that followed this unbanning ultimately led to multi-party negotiations, which paved the way for South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994. These elections marked the end of white minority rule and the official dismantling of apartheid. The peaceful transition to democracy was the culmination of years of internal and external pressure, and it was made possible in part by the global changes brought about by Gorbachev's reforms and the end of the Cold War. In conclusion, Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union during the 1980s had a profound impact on the South African political landscape, influencing FW de Klerk's decision to introduce reforms from 1989. The Soviet Union's economic hardships, coupled with the implementation of Perestroika and Glasnost, led to the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. This in turn eroded the apartheid government's ability to justify its policies and forced the National Party to negotiate with the ANC. The end of Soviet support for the ANC also pushed the liberation movement towards negotiations, resulting in a peaceful transition to democracy in South Africa. Thus, it is evident that Gorbachev's reforms played a crucial role in shaping the events that led to the end of apartheid and the establishment of a new political order in South Africa.
To access more learning and exam preparation materials, go to www.acemyexams.coza. This link is also in the video description below. Thank you for watching this video. Remember to subscribe and be the first to know when we upload new videos.